Hi, my name is Robin Swanek, and I'm the Associate State Director for Community Outreach for AARP Nebraska. So for the month of September, we've been doing a 5-part series at the Hastings Museum to let you know what is inside the Hastings Museum and its rich history. Now, you'll be able to view these series here on Facebook live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time. And again, that's at the AARP Nebraska Facebook page. After each event, these segments can still be found on our page. So make sure if you see it that you do like us and follow our AARP Nebraska page on Facebook so you can see what we're doing on the virtual end of engagements. So today it is part 4 in our series, and this one is called Did You Know? These are going to be all about the interesting artifacts that can be found there at the Hastings Museum. Teresa Kreitzer-Hodson, who is the curator of collections at the Hastings Museum, is joining us to go through the interesting facts that she can divulge to us here on our series today. So welcome, Teresa, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me again. I really have fun doing this, and I hope everybody appreciates it.
So what do you want to do with us today?
So through the years, I've learned so much about our collection, and some of the research that I've done has kind of surprised me on like some interesting tidbits about these collections. You can't be an expert in everything, but sometimes these little trivia things can spark really interesting conversations. So that's kind of what I want to share today, is just some interesting things that I've kind of learned about different parts of our collection through the years.
Great. Well, I'm excited for you to get started and to tell us about these artifacts, but keep in mind afterwards, we will do some Q&A to see if we can stump you and you can answer what you do know about my questions. So let's hear it, Teresa.
Sounds good. Well, again, thank you for having me and everybody out there joining us today. Like I said, I want to share some of our stories about our collections, and I've kind of themed it around the idea of, did you know? So if we can start with our second slide, actually. We have an automobile in our collection that is probably the most asked about thing that we have. Lots of researchers, people who are interested in refurbishing cars, ask a lot of questions about this vehicle. The unique thing about this is, did you know that the electric car has been around for over 100 years? It wasn't just one company that made them either. There were several companies that were in competition. And here at the museum, we have a 1912 Roush & Lang electric car on display. This particular company started in the mid-1880s as a partnership in the carriage business with family ties to Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. They had lots of money to try out new ventures and stuff. So they decided to start selling electric cars for a different company in 1903, the Buffalo Electric Automobile. But they liked this product so much and they wanted to kind of develop their own. So in 1905, they started out with a Roush & Lang electric car. Like I said, ours is in 1912, and this was the height of their production and sales for their electric cars. In that year, they sold 356,000 electric cars, and ours is one of them. At the time, electric cars were far more beneficial than gas-powered cars for a lot of different reasons, some that we think of today, but others, and mainly how they started. The old gas-powered cars had to be hand-cranked, and you had to have pretty good stamina and muscles to get that to crank and turn over. So the electric cars were far easier, and they were a lot quieter than the gas-powered. And of course, the thing that we think about today is they don't produce any fumes. The disadvantage was how far they could go. They didn't have a very far-reaching travel, so you got a few miles away from home, and then you had to worry about, could you make it back? In 1915, the automatic starter, the electric start for the gas-powered motors came into production, and the electric cars started to kind of fade out. Next slide, please. But one of the things that kept them in business was they were targeting women with their advertising. And part of that was because of how they started the vehicle. It was a lot easier for women to start the electric cars than to turn those hand cranks. And to class it up, the Roush and Lang even had an option where you could put a flower vase in there. The resident of Hastings, Hattie Clark, owned one of these cars, and you can see her pictured in her car up there on the top. We don't know if it's the same one that's in our collection. There's some similarities, but there also looks like there's some differences. It's kind of hard to tell, but she was one of those women that had purchased one of these vehicles. This picture was taken in about 1920 of her and her vehicle. And you can see from some of the advertising there on the side how they did incorporate women into their advertising in order to entice them. And today, if you have an electric car and you come to the Hastings Museum, you can recharge your car at our power station in our parking lot. So we are in the whole business of helping people out who have electric cars even yet today. Next slide, please. Did you know that the prairie dog is considered a keystone species of the prairie? A keystone species is one of the animals that is very important to other animals' survival. In some way, they help the other species thrive. So prairie dog towns support a diverse number of species, both large and small. Their burrowing activities improve the soil structure. They bring up subsoil minerals to the surface, which helps improve the nutritional value of the grass and also gives more variety to the types of grass that grow around their towns. Large grazers like bison traditionally, as well as pronghorn deer, they like going to these towns and eating that grass because it helps their nutritional value raise in what they're eating. In return, they kind of keep the grass short around the holes so that the prairie dogs can see their predators coming. More importantly, it's the smaller animals like burrowing owls, black-footed ferrets, and snakes that rely on the holes of prairie dogs. They use them for their own shelter away from predators that are out to get them as well. Plus, there's just a lot of different insects and microfauna that live in and around these holes that just kind of keep everybody healthy and keeps the landscape nutritious for everybody to eat. An example of the impact the prairie dog has had on another species can be seen in the black-footed ferret population. The black-footed ferret was the first mammal that was placed on the endangered species list in 1967. By the 1970s, people thought that they were pretty much extinct. There really wasn't a lot of them being found anywhere. But luckily, in 1981, a small population was discovered in Meeteetse, Wyoming. There were 18 that were captured, and they were taken into captivity for breeding to try and bring the species back. Kind of through trial and error, the scientists have been able to revive the species, and they have been able to repopulate certain areas. But what they learned is that the black-footed ferret was so dependent on the prairie dog towns for their survival because they're kind of slow diggers, and they really need to have those shelters that they find in the prairie dog town. Today, scientists will only release the black-footed ferret into the wild if there's a prairie dog town that has at least 32,000 living prairie dogs, as well as about 5,000 acres of land or so. So it just kind of goes to show why the prairie dog is important to other species. And it really made me think when we found this out, why the prairie dog has been so controversial about whether or not they should be on the endangered species list. I kind of see it from both points now. So just a tidbit that I've learned through my research. Next slide, please. Did you know that interactive exhibits in museums is not a new trend? Here at the Hastings Museum, we've had one from that dates back to 1948. It's a really beloved piece, and it's the most important button ever in our building. While this button operates a very simple motor, the joy, or maybe the fear, depending on your opinion of snakes, is immeasurable. Plus, it doesn't break down that easy, although I better knock on wood, because last time I said that, it broke down. But it's something that we have been able to maintain and keep going. And what this interactive does, if you're not familiar with our museum, is when you push that button, the rattlesnakes there inside, the mother, her tail will rattle in. You can hear what a rattle sounds like. Just another kind of tidbit thing for the museum. These rattlesnakes were collected in 1947 in Hastings, Nebraska. And at the time, there were 16 babies. Today, we only have 12. We really don't know where those other 4 went, so it's kind of our unsolved mystery here at the museum. Next slide, please. So our next one that we're going to talk about today is the Tommy gun. Did you know that the Tommy gun gained the reputation as a gangster gun, mostly because of movies? Well, let me tell you about it. John Thompson started out designing his gun to be something for the military. We were in the midst of World War I, and he wanted to give the soldiers something that had a lot of rounds, but was lightweight so that they could carry it with them as they went through the trenches. And that was what he intended for his Thompson machine gun. However, by the time he kind of perfected it, World War I was over, and so he was too late to offer it to the military. So he offered it to the public. So police officers, civilians, including criminals, anybody could buy a Thompson machine gun. But really what rose it to the level of the gangster gun was probably partially because of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. There were 2 of these Thompson machine guns that were used to mow down 7 members of a rival gang. In total, they fired off 70 rounds in pretty rapid order from 2 of these guns. In an incident such as this, though, there is an apparent problem with the gun. The rapid repeat fire makes the barrel rise, so each shot is hard to control the aim for it. So it makes it more feasible if you do kind of that short burst rat-a-tat-tat and kind of swinging it back and forth to keep it from rising up. But nonetheless, you know, it gained the gangster notoriety, and that's where you get the violin case with the gun broken down into it. And like I said, a lot of these images have come because of the movies in Hollywood. Just as a side note, you see the image there with Winston Churchill holding one of those guns, and you'll notice that it has a foregrip on it. The one that we have in our museum pictured on the very top doesn't have that, but the one that he has does, and that is to help control the gun and keep it from lifting up. By the time World War II rolled around, that is when the Tommy gun really became part of the military, and it was used in all operations throughout World War II, as well as Korea and Vietnam. And that's the gun that we have in our collection is actually a World War II era model, and not the first one that came out in World War I. Next slide, please. Not to be totally morbid, but did you know that it's unusual to find an unused child's coffin made prior to mass production of caskets? And we have 3. Prior to funeral homes, as we know them, local furniture and cabinet makers used to make coffins as they were needed. So they didn't have a showroom that they could show off their choices. So they didn't keep these coffins around. What people did is if somebody passed away, a lot of the death rituals were carried out in the home while the cabinet maker was busy building the coffin. About the only choice that people had as to what the coffin looked like was whether or not it had fancy hardware. So the casket screws and the handles were about their only choices. Possibly the color, because we do have one that's white, but that was really about all that they had choices for. As houses and people's attitudes changed, the death rituals were kind of taken over by the cabinet makers and the furniture store owners, which is how we came to have mortuaries in the back of furniture stores. The Civil War, because there was so many people dying, it also kind of ushered in a new era of mass-producing caskets. It wasn't something that was very common, but you know, they did start making more and more, not necessarily to have as a showroom, but just because they needed them. And do you know the difference between a coffin and a casket? Coffins are the ones like you see in our image here that have the 6 or 8 sides, and it's meant to closely fit the body. And the reason they did that was to kind of minimize the amount of dirt that they had to dig, because they didn't have backhoes back then. They had to dig this all by hand. So it was easier to just dig a smaller hole. And then we have caskets, which came about because more of mass producing, and they have our four sides that we think of today. And yes, we also have body baskets, and these were made to carry the bodies from the mortuary, or to the mortuary from the home, and they were often reused. And we also have one of those in our museum as well. These particular children's caskets that we do have are from a funeral home that was in Kennesaw, and were donated to the museum. Next slide, please. Did you know quartz is the most common found mineral? It is a silicate that appears in many forms in a lot of different conditions around the world. Pure quartz is colorless, and you can kind of see that on the tip of the tall quartz piece that we have on the right there. But when other minerals taint the formula, it can give you a lot of different colors. If you add iron in, the quartz can become amethyst. Titanium makes it turn pink, so it's rose quartz. And smoky quartz occurs when you get a little bit of aluminum in it. And you can see a sample of the smoky quartz there in the center. Now, quartz has become very important to industry. And so with all of the use, sometimes you need more pure samples of quartz. And so people have learned how to lab grow quartz, and that is the piece that you see over there on the left. Within the telephone industry, they needed a nice piece of clear quartz to make your telephones work, and so they grew samples, or grew crystals like this one at the Western Electric and Bell Laboratories, and they still do that today. They have a method that we talk about in our exhibits, and it's also that we can survive and have our phones in this day and age. Next slide, please. And while we're talking about rocks and minerals, did you know that some minerals fluoresce under ultraviolet light? It's a very small percentage, it's only about 15%, and they have to contain the right impurities to do so. So just because one sample of a mineral may glow, the same mineral may not in another sample, just because it doesn't have the impurities. It's these impurities that are known as activators that really make the difference, and it also kind of determines the color that will glow. Another factor is the different wavelengths. So what I have here is the picture on the left is just natural lighting. That's what these samples look like. And then if you look on the right side, the top is a long wave UV light, and the bottom is a short wave. So that makes a difference on the different colors that will show through as well. And so these are the exact same specimens. It just kind of shows you what those impurities can do. We recently rebuilt our fluorescent rock room to just demonstrate this reaction, and we have a lot of different samples out there, and you can come and take a look at all these samples and see what different things can glow, including your shoestrings and white shirts and everything else. It's one of the things that kids love. Next slide, please. Did you know that these animals all once lived in Nebraska? While some, like the passenger pigeon, have gone extinct, human pressure through overhunting and habitat loss has pushed out, or what we call extirpated, others of these animals from the state. The gray wolf once roamed most of the United States, including Nebraska, and the ones that lived here were called prairie or lobo wolves. One of the last known wolves in Nebraska was killed in 1926 near Oconto, Nebraska. While there are no plans to reintroduce the wolves to Nebraska, they still are on the state endangered species list. Grizzly bears, which is a subspecies of brown bears, also roam Nebraska, particularly the mixed grass and shortgrass prairies of the western part of the state. Lewis and Clark wrote about them. They estimated there was about 50,000 of them living in the territory here. And notable American Indians wore necklaces made out of their claws. And you can see that in many of the images with Chief Standing Bear, who was a Ponca tribal member. He has a bear claw necklace, and there's other tribes that also carried on that tradition. As settlers killed off the bison, which was a food source for these bears, and made the soil into fields, the bears kind of retreated to the mountains, or they were killed, and so we have no more in the state. In recent years, they have spotted some bears coming down out of the mountains into prairie grass fields in Montana. It's not common, but they are kind of branching out a little bit back into their original habitats. I'm sure all of you have paid attention to the news in the last 25 to 30 years, and you hear about mountain lions every once in a while. And they're coming back into Nebraska to reclaim their territory. Like the grizzly bears, they were pushed out partially because of loss of habitat, because of loss of food, and then just the pressure that we placed on them. So by the end of the 1800s, they were pretty much out of the state. But more recently, they've been making a comeback, and there is an established population in the very northwest part of the state. Those that venture out, the scientists have determined, have been mostly males, and they're on the prowl for another female, and they're also looking for their own territories. I do have a website at the bottom here, outdoornebraska.gov, at-risk species, and this lists some of the other animals and plants that are in Nebraska that are listed on the endangered species. But I just thought, you know, it's kind of interesting, some of these animals. And then, of course, then there's the bison. We had some roaming free here a couple of weeks ago around Holdridge and Loomis, but that is not typical. And again, a lot of their pressure came from being overhunted until there was only a small group of them left in Yellowstone. It took conservationists their efforts to bring them back, and now they're living in national parks around the country as well as on tribal reservations. And we have a number of ranchers who are raising bison for meat. Next slide, please. Can you imagine being taken from your home as a child and forced to conform to an unfamiliar life? On top of that, you have no contact with your family. So you have no mom, you have no dad, no grandparents, possibly no siblings. You're just all alone. This is what thousands of American Indian children faced in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools so that they could become civilized. No tribe or family was exempt from this cultural genocide. Once at school, the kids were stripped of their Indian identity, both visually, linguistically, and spiritually. And that's what these two braids represent. They represent the cultural change that Rufus Ironstar, a Secongoe, or Lakota boy who was from the Rosebud Reservation. It's what he faced when he went to school in 1920. We don't know much about Rufus other than by the 1940 census, it looked like he only completed 4 years of school. For whatever reason, he didn't finish. But this is one of the things that we have learned about as we go through our collections and stuff, that we do have some things that represent this. Next slide, please. And because of the importance of this issue, we are hosting a traveling exhibit this fall that shares the history of Indian boarding schools, such as Carlisle and Haskell. And did you know we had one in Genoa, Nebraska as well? I invite you in the months of November and December to come and learn more about these institutions. And you can kind of see from these images the difference that these institutions had on the culture of tribes. This is the same gentleman on both pictures, and this is discussed in that traveling exhibit. Next slide, please. While we're talking about upcoming events, we do have some other events coming up that you might be interested in if you're in the area. History on Wheels is a bike tour that we're going to be taking around Hastings. It is a guided tour, and you'll learn some history about the area. If you have preschoolers, we have a preschool play day coming up that's all about Thanksgiving. And then we also have a new product. It's a whodunit or a murder mystery that will also take place in our downtown Hastings. So next slide, please. If you want to come and take a look at any of these artifacts that we've talked about in the last 4 series, please feel free to come to the Hastings Museum, but I do encourage you to check our website for our current hours. Right now they're pretty steady, but just in case before you make that trip, just check and make sure that we are open. Our website is hastingsmuseum.org. I thank you for your interest and hope you learned a little bit something new. Maybe you knew some of this, but maybe you also learned some new tidbits that you can stump your friends with.
Thank you, Teresa. Again, a great walk down the halls of the Hastings Museum to learn a little bit more about what's going on in our state, what happened in our state, but also what some of these great artifacts actually have as a meaning behind them.
Mm-hmm.
So I've created some questions and I'm out there to stump you, and I don't mean to, but let's see what I do.
Okay.
So for the automobile, the electric car 1912, did that donation come from somebody in the Nebraska Hastings area, or are you sure about that one?
No, actually that came from a Hastings resident. It was in his collection. You know, you can make some jumps to say, well, maybe that is Hattie Clark's car. You know, it was just purchased and refinished through the years. You know, we really don't know. We don't have a good clear title on that, you know, a title history for that piece. But yeah, it came from Hastings.
Great. Okay. How many vehicles would you say are located inside the museum on display?
Well, if you take the horse-powered and the motorized, we have, I think it's roughly 12 or 13 here, including a sleigh. We do have the hearse, that the children's coffins, 2 of those are placed in the hearse. We also have a REO Speedwagon, which is very fun to talk about. And it's kind of where the band got their name from. So yeah, we have a variety of things.
Very nice. Okay, prairie dogs, big jump here. Yep. Do you know how many colonies are in Nebraska?
I don't, and it does change. There isn't a lot of substantial colonies, which is why, from what I'm understanding in my research, why the black-footed ferret has not been reintroduced to Nebraska, because we don't have the size of a prairie dog town that they would need to survive. You know, ranchers still try to get rid of them because of, you know, potential for their cattle or their other livestock to step in a hole. But we have a few larger towns. I know there's one on the Naval Ammunition Depot site, mostly because there isn't animals running around out there that could step into those holes. So yeah.
Very good. All right, let's go to the Tommy gun. Can you tell me how the museum received this offering?
Well, like a lot of our automatic weapons, this piece came from the U.S. Department of Armory. So it was a defense surplus item, I guess, if you will. Most places, including gun dealers, can't have fully automatic weapons. So the reason that we've gotten ours is because they've been disabled. Before they were donated to the museum, they went through and they welded them, so they can't be fired at all, which is why we have them. Otherwise, it'd be very illegal for us to have them.
It's a nice addition to your collection.
Yeah.
All right, let's slip over to the endangered animals. And what was the name of the first one that was a pigeon, but what was its full name?
Oh, it's a passenger pigeon.
Passenger pigeon.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really talk about those. Passenger pigeon was a very colorful bird that flew in huge flocks. They didn't really come to central Nebraska, but they did hit the eastern part of the state. Their plumage was used for hats and other accessories, and so they were hunted, and people just thought they could continue to shoot, so they'd shoot when these big flocks would come over, and there's lots of different people that write about how they would block out the sun. There was so many of them. But after a while, there wasn't so many, and yeah, they have gone extinct. There are no more.
Do you know approximately when that happened?
Let's see. If I remember right, the last one died in captivity in Cincinnati Zoo in, I want to say it was 1918.
Oh, wow. A very long
I'm
time.
certain about the place, but I'm not, I think it was 1918. I'm not 100% sure on the date.
Wow. I love the information that you shared with us, Teresa. I'm also very excited to see your November exhibit talking about the boarding schools that were created. And specifically, you did name Genoa, Nebraska. So again, what rich information you'll be able to share. And I'm excited to actually be able to go see that.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for today. Please keep in mind, this isn't our last one. We are doing this again next week, and we're actually going to talk about something probably very near and dear to most Hastings residents, if not the state of Nebraska, and that is the actual history of Kool-Aid. And I'm excited to see what you have in your exhibits of everything that was created from the beginning up until today. So I know that'll take some time, and I can hardly wait. I've got my notebook out ready to take notes.
Awesome.
So again, Teresa, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you very much. See you then.